Hello and welcome to the British Book Guy. I haven't filmed in a little while and it feels good to be back filming again. So I'm going to quickly do the wrap up. So I'm going to separate the wrap up and the book haul because, you know, I usually put them together because I've done so abysmally. The wrap up is still not very good, but the book haul is, that's what I'm waiting for. So the first book I read in the lovely month of December was Big Fish by Daniel Wallace. So because my memory is abysmal, I just thought that I'd read Big Fish, like I forgot what I'd read, and so I was going to start presenting the wrong books and not summarise the books properly because I should probably remember more what I've read. I suppose I can't even say I read so much I forget what I have read. The first book I read this month wasn't in fact Big Fish, it is Catch-22. I thought I did it in the last one, I hadn't. If I have, there's a bit of an overlap. You get to watch the same summary twice, aren't you lucky? I really liked this book. I didn't expect to like it so much. I've put it off for maybe a year and a half, maybe 2 years before I finally got around to reading it. And I read it because I was sick of it just being on my shelf and not being read. I was just like, just clear it out. Read the damn book. Such a good book. It's not what I expected it to be. I'd read like a summary of the book, which made me think that something else was going to happen in the book. That it would be like behind enemy lines and it'd be just this squadron of teammates who, you know, I guess I'm thinking more like what films are today more than what the actual book was, because it all takes place on one island where it's not necessarily in combat, all kind of behind the lines and what they're like outside of combat, which is great. The only exception to that is you do see them in some of the fights, and throughout the book there's this, you hear a lot about this character called Snowden. You don't find out what happened to him. So anyway, you go through this really humorous book, really funny book. Characters are brilliant, they all get enough spotlight, they're all treated really well, and until the end. And then you get to the end and you find out what happened to Snowden, and it is one of the most harrowing scenes I've ever read. And suddenly everything, like that, Yossarian's whole perspective on the war and to his, you know, to his friends, the people who he flies with, the people who he lives with essentially, it kind of all comes together and it's a really nice moment. Well, it's not a nice moment, but it's a cathartic moment. And it all makes sense, and I'm not going to tell you what happens to Snowden or what it is because you should read it. Like, it's not right until the end where you find out what happens, but it's just worth reading the whole book, just that one harrowing moment kind of at the end. Obviously the whole book is worth reading because it is fantastic, it's funny, it pulls you along really well, it is quite a long read, it took me a little while. So yeah, Catch-22, amazing book. So, onto the book that I thought I had read but I hadn't. Big Fish by Daniel Wallace. Now, if you saw my other videos, this was in my book haul. I said it wouldn't take me long to get to, and I was right. What I've had a problem with, I had it with Stardust in the last video, I've had it with this, is separating the book from a movie, and that's a really unfair thing to do. You shouldn't judge a book from a movie adaptation. So I hate to say it, but this isn't as good as the film, and I shouldn't say it because they're not the same thing. They did some things in the film which I really liked, and the themes are more prevalent. It kind of all tied together at the beginning and the end. The love stories are much nicer, it's much more involved with the main character. You know, Edward Bloom is a much bigger character in the film. I'm not really talking about the book, am I? If I say something about the film, assume that it's kind of the opposite in the book. It was a good book, I did enjoy it, and I'm really glad I've read it. But it does stand up on its own merits, don't get that wrong. Don't think that it's a film now you can forget that the book exists, because it is worth reading and it's worth seeing, because like in any book, parts were left out, things happen in the book that you don't see in the film, but the relationships were different in the film and they worked better, and the character was larger than life, and in this, you know, it feels like he's trying to get him to be larger than life, but it kind of fails, and, you know, just a lot of things don't happen that I'd have liked to have happened, or I expected to happen, but fell flat. It's not a bad book. I'm sitting here trying to say, is it a bad book? It's not a bad book. And you can't judge a book by saying it wasn't as good as the film, just pass it off like that. Except The Hunger Games, because those books were abysmal. Good book, worth a read, let me down. So we get to this book now, and the book before it was in the wrap-up I think last month, and then the book before that, 'cause this is the last in the trilogy, was in the wrap-up before that, I'm not too sure. That is Half a War by Joe Abercrombie. Shiny page, very nice hardback, reflecting in the light. And there's a lot of things that this trilogy did really well, and I really like it, and there's a few things it kind of did wrong. What it's done in each book is it's introduced new characters for that book. you've got the old characters from the old book, and there's one, Father Yarvi, who's the main character in all three of them, who book by book is taking a backseat, and then there's characters who are in the first book who take a backseat in the second one, and then a further backseat in this one, and it does that to introduce new characters. And the new characters are great, and they hold up, they work as main characters in a book. But it starts to get cluttered for space. He's trying to think too much about the old characters who've carried the book so far, so he doesn't want to drop them. He's trying to give enough time to the new characters. So it all gets a bit clustered and you don't know who to root for. So when you read it, your thoughts are divided, and you kind of want to give as much attention to each of the characters equally. You know, you've read these two great characters in the second book, and now they take a back seat, but they're still in the third book, and you really want to follow them because they were so good in the second book. And you want to see what's happened to them in the third book, but the book doesn't give them that much space. Instead, it kind of pushes them down, pushes them back for the new characters. And like I said, that's not a bad thing because the new characters are great and they do all work together, so it is good. It gets thick and it gets complicated and it gets hard to follow, and you don't know quite what's happening and what everyone is doing, because by the third book, they've introduced a lot of characters. I'm not talking Game of Thrones amount of characters, but for what's meant to be a quite easy fantasy read, there's a lot of characters. But the plot in this book is what really did it for me. So I said that the main character really throughout is a character called Father Yarvi. He's smart and he's cunning, and the writing is really good for him. He's written really well, so he is smart and he is cunning. But the plot moves fantastically all the way throughout. There wasn't one moment in my whole trilogy where I thought this is getting boring. And I absolutely loved it for that, and it did such a good job of the pacing, of the plot pulling together through all three books. At the end of it, it all comes into one beautiful plot arc, and that's what I really liked about it. So the characters were great, even though I felt they didn't have enough space and time, and some of them got left behind. The characters that you didn't want to get left behind did get left behind, but the plot really made up for that, and that's why I really, really, really like this book. Another book from the last month's book called Station 11, and this book didn't take the turn I expected it to take. It wasn't what I expected it to be, and that's not a bad thing, you know. If we were disappointed by every book we thought would take another direction that took a direction that it did take, we probably wouldn't like many books. While I was reading this, I wasn't sure what to make of it, and I wasn't sure how much I liked it. You know, I read it quickly enough. There wasn't a point where I thought, this isn't so good that I'm going to stop reading it. It carried me along quite nicely, but there were parts of it that felt a bit preachy. A big theme in it is how much we've lost in this post-apocalyptic world, how much we've lost from the old world, and how much is just paying an homage to everything that we have today that we could lose in an instant. So that was a really big theme, which at times I quite liked. It was quite nice to appreciate everything we've got, but then it suddenly became like a kind of telling people off for taking things for granted. Like, you know, I've got this camera on my phone, you shouldn't take those for granted because in a second they could all be gone. There were no characters in this that I felt were amazing, that I felt were totally memorable, that I went away and couldn't stop thinking about. But then when I did finish it and I thought about the plot and I thought about how it all came together, what this book does really well. So the book is split into two parts, the before and the after, and you follow different characters at different points in the before and after this post-apocalyptic world. And it does a really fantastic job, better than any book I've read, of drawing all of those characters together. So every single one is connected. You might not find out how until the very end of a book for one or two of the characters, but in their own way, they do all then eventually come together, and that's marvellous. And that's done really well. Like, it's never cheesy. You can absolutely believe that those circumstances would come together to bring those characters all together. And that's fantastic. That's really good writing. That's really good plotting. And because it was done so well, and it was a good plot, and it was interesting, and it was a really unique and very nice world. So yeah, I really liked this book. Did a lot of things wrong, but equally, it did a hell of a lot of things right. Now, the next book is exciting in its own right, because what it was me finishing my 52 books a year for my Goodreads challenge. Yes! And unfortunately, it wasn't a very exciting book. It was actually a pretty dull book. It was Dreamwalker by J.D. Oswald. If you remember in my book haul last month, I bought 3 books all in one series, even though I'd never read the first one, and this is the first one. Because I thought, well, I've got all of them now, so I should probably start reading them. It was dull. Nothing much happened in it. It was just one big introduction to the rest of the series. So it kind of introduced you to the characters, put the characters in the right places, the two main characters of a human named Errol and a dragon called Benfro. Put them in the right places. Introduce the side characters, and the antagonist is someone who you know is going to be the antagonist probably throughout the whole quadrilogy. And then it kind of blipped. It ended, and that was that. It wasn't a good book. It didn't stand up on its own. It's nothing more really than an introduction to the rest of the series, which is kind of a shame because it could have been a good book. It's not a bad world. The language is terrible. The world is called, I think, Gwlad, or Gwlad. Gwlad. How the hell do you pronounce that? Because I'm English and I live quite close to Wales, some of the things I think I could wrap my head around because I've been to Wales and I know a little bit about the language, but if you don't know anything about Welsh language, which it's really based on, I think it reminds me of Welsh. If it's not strictly Welsh, don't quote me on that, and I don't want anyone to come up in the comments and be like, you arsehole, you're wrong, it's not Welsh, it's something else. So it reminded me of Welsh and it felt Welsh, and because I had a little bit of Welsh understanding, I was able to get my head around some of the words. Rant over. So I could just about make sense of a world, but if you didn't know anything about it, you probably wouldn't know how to pronounce a damn thing. And it really felt like the language is just built up to obfuscate. There's really no point to how it being so complicated. But the world is nice, the world is exciting, it's quite big, there's a lot I can sense that's going to happen, so even though this wasn't a good book, and by all rights I shouldn't be looking forward to the next one, I am. Because like I said, it set it up for the next one, which promises to be good. All the characters are now in the right places for the story to start proper, so not a good book, but probably worth reading because the series is promising. So like I said, that was me completing my Goodreads challenge. I'll do a whole video on that, probably after I film this, if my camera doesn't die, it's out of battery. But yeah, at least I did, 52 books a year, yeah. So that was December's wrap up. Like I said, I did manage to finish my 52 books a year Goodreads challenge. I'll be doing a whole video on that later. I don't know when don't know when, but I will try and get it done. And I hope you liked this video. I hope you liked the books I'm reading. Let me know if you liked any of the books I read, what you thought of them, if you don't agree with what I've said. Let me know what you think of the videos. As always, I read every single comment that you guys post. I love feedback. And that's this episode done. Thank you so much for watching. Leave a like if you liked, and I'll see you next video.